Chapter 1 is a very brief introduction in the Trawick-Smith book to the idea of studying child development from a multicultural perspective and why to study child development at all. And in addition to that, I want to give you a little more information. I do want to touch on the idea of culture, though. Many of my students say, I don't have culture. But actually, everybody has culture. It's what we bring with us as teachers or as parents. It's the traditions that we celebrated. One of the videos that you'll see in this class shows my family celebrating one of my children's second birthday. And the way we celebrate is quite different from the way people in many other cultures might celebrate. And so I ask you to take a look at that in that assignment. But you think about people in other lands maybe shave the baby's head at the end of the first year, or have a huge party sort of equivalent to a potlatch or a wedding celebration, a reception, like hundreds of people that might be invited because it's such a celebration for the baby to have made it through the first year of life. So everybody has culture. Sometimes it's hard for us to see our own culture because we're so used to it. It's what we grew up with. If we celebrate certain holidays, or we eat certain foods, or we use certain terminology, or even how we play with our children or how we talk to our children, that can all be part of our culture. So everybody has culture, and part of this class will be looking at child development through a variety of different cultures, so that when you work with other people's children and other families, you have an idea that they might view things differently. But an important part of this chapter that isn't covered in the book, an important part of the lesson, is about the 4 parts of development. And you'll be studying this over the course of the whole semester, so I like to give a summary in this first chapter. And I call it the pies of development. So if you think about a pie, and you were to cut it into 4 equal pieces and put the letter P-I-E-S, pies, that would help you remember the 4 parts of development. And it's really about human development, not just child development. But when we think of the P in the pies, it's about physical development. And that's the fine motor skills. It's the little tiny pieces that babies pick up. When my grandson was small, I used to let him play with the drawer, with tools and a plastics drawer that I have under the oven, and he found this thing that's a shaker for shaking up eggs and such, and it has this little spinning piece in it that you use to shake the eggs. And he discovered, I guess I showed him, and then he was fascinated by it, and he discovered that if he took the very end of it, he could spin it. And that little practice was fine motor skills for him. So all the small things, even blinking, even sucking, those things could be considered fine motor skills. Another part of physical is the large muscle, or the gross motor skills, and that's the walking, the jumping, the climbing, the big muscles, the throwing, the swinging around with things. All of that is large muscle. But physical is more than just small and large muscles. It's also about nutrition and health and sleep and vision and hearing. Some people would say that language, the ability to produce language with the way your tongue works and the parts of your mouth, is physical. I would say language primarily falls under another category, but there's an element to it that is physical. So physical development is an important one. I often think of it as being first because it's easiest, if you think there's a problem with a child, it's easiest to look at physical issues first, and they're often the easiest to remedy or to make some accommodation for, so that then the child can go on. If a child needs a hearing aid, for example, if you take care of the hearing, then it's easier to go on to the other parts of development. So the next one would be the I in the pies of development, and the I is for intellectual development. Some people might call it cognitive. Your book probably refers to it more as cognitive than as intellectual. But I like calling it intellectual because it's easier for me to remember the pies, the 4 parts of development, And intellectual is about thinking, and that's what we mean by cognitive. It's not just about memorizing. So sometimes people want to show kids colors or shapes and get them to learn the names and kind of memorize maybe from flashcards. And that really isn't the best way to support intellectual development with young children. That's just rote memory, and it's so easy to teach children their colors in a more natural way as they're putting on their shoes or by what they're wearing that day or the world around them. Look at the leaves are turning yellow or things like that. The grass is coming up. So we can look around us and teach children colors. We don't have to use something artificial and try and get them to memorize it from flashcards. But the important part of intellectual has to do with curiosity and wondering what the world is all about and exploring and thinking up new things, new ways to do things. Creativity falls under the realm of intellectual in the 4 parts of development, because to be creative is to think of a new way to do it, a new dance motion, a new way to play on the instrument, a new song that you write yourself. That would be creative, and it requires this kind of intellectual cognitive skill. Another part that falls often under intellectual is language and literacy. Those are primarily intellectual processes. So learning to speak and learning to read would mostly fall under intellectual category. Memory does fall under it, but it's not the most important part. The curiosity, the questioning, the exploration, those are the most important part, because when they grow up, it's so much more important not just to have memorized facts, but to be able to solve problems. And so if we want to deal with changes in our environment or global warming or the salmon that haven't returned or different problems that come back, we need people who are creative thinkers, not just people who've memorized the names of the different kinds of salmon. So that's intellectual development. I like to separate social and emotional into 2 parts of development. Many authors, including the ones that you'll be reading about in our textbook, like to put social and emotional together. Sometimes they do that because they think that they are combined, and sometimes in a textbook they do it because there's pressure to not make the book be too many chapters long. But for evaluating children's development and really guiding and supporting them to the next stage of development, it's much better to have intellectual separated, to have emotional and social separated. You'll see me make a few mistakes on these videos, and I just decided that I wasn't going to try and re-record them every time. I would simply go on as if I was lecturing in a class, and I'd make the mistake and acknowledge it and move forward. So there's my first one in chapter 1. Back to emotional development. Emotional development is about self. It's about the child's sense of who they are and their competence. There's really 2 parts to emotional development. There's the I can and the I am. The I am is about identity. I am a girl or I am a boy. It might be their ethnicity. I am Irish or I am Yupik or I am Athabascan, or whatever the correct native words would be for that. It might be that it's a sense of I belong to a particular community, like a religious community. I am Mormon or I am Jewish or something like that. And although babies don't identify that yet, they're surrounded with those kinds of messages, with the ways we celebrate and the language that we use and the foods that we eat. And so their sense of identity, they can't tell you the words, but they are beginning to develop a sense of what groups they belong to and what values they hold. So the I am is an identity piece, and the I can is about ability. I can pick up finger food. I can self-regulate, get myself to sleep. I can begin to use the potty. I can climb, I can push myself on a riding tricycle. All the things that they are able to do. And as they get older, they're acknowledged with some of those things, sometimes with sports medals or things like that as they get beyond the preschool, beyond the toddler years. But even as young children, babies, infants and toddlers, they're beginning to develop this sense of what they can do, how capable they are. My grandson was thrilled when he could begin to spin this little dial. So that's the emotional part, and they develop a sense of whether or not they're good or whether they're naughty. They develop a sense of their independence, what they're capable of doing. That's all emotional development. It's about the sense of self. The social development is not so much about the individual as it is about their relationship with others. So social being their connections to other people. How well do they play with others? Can they share toys? Will they look at you and come to you when you put out your hands and reach for them? Will they play peekaboo with you when they're small? Do they watch? Are they watchers and then get into things? Or are they the kind of kids who just charge forward and then they're getting into trouble a lot, and maybe in some situations being contained in ways that might not be as good for their social development? Are they around a lot of other children their age, cousins, or in a child care center, or in a play group, or brothers and sisters? Those will all influence their social skills. And I'm not talking here so much about things like whether or not they say please and thank you and excuse me and no to sneeze into their arm, but it's not so much the polite things as getting along with others. So it's sharing, it's leadership, it's cooperating, it's listening, it's being able to give and take in a relationship. And that's what the social development is all about. So that's the pies of development. Sometimes we use spies, and the spies would be spiritual development, the S. But because spiritual is so different to very many people, we haven't, as the profession, identified spiritual in a particular way. So some people might say that spiritual encompasses all of it. It's the environment that the child grows up in. They might draw their S all around the pies. Some people might say, no, spiritual is related to social, so it is part of the social values that a child is given, their religious values or whatever. Some people might relate spiritual to the physical world and how there's a balance with nature. So because spiritual is very different to each family and each child, the way they're growing up, we don't include it as a definite, we don't define it in the spies. But I would like you to think about it and think about what your values are and be sure that you are ready to support each child's spiritual development. Under intellectual, I was going to show you that you don't have to have a lot of fancy stuff to support kids' intellectual development. My youngest granddaughter was given this slinky when she was a small baby, and it's been just fascinating for her that it can roll and it can stretch and she can put her hand through it, and just a fascinating, inexpensive, but a toy that's very curious for her and all the different things she can do with it. So that's just a reminder that we can support children in all parts of the pies in ways that are not too expensive, usually with things that we have in our own environment and our own home. So those are the 4 parts of development. PIES, we'll refer to them a lot.